Eisiam heisiaia, ait nesqualawan, equitsquitsnolets, anta Tsleil-Waututh, Tsleil-Waututh. Just like to welcome everybody here. It's a great crowd. I'm so happy to be up here with this young lady. I'm not used to using a mic because every time I get in front of a mic, I want to sing. I hear the tankers coming. They're coming through the Narrows. I don't know where they're gonna crash, but I know it's sometime soon. Oh well. Ladies first.
Hi, I'm Hillary. My ancestral name is Tiaktana, and I'm from the Tsleil-Waututh and Stolo Nation. I'm not a very strong public speaker, so excuse my stammering, but I didn't want to pass up the opportunity to speak today. When I was asked to speak, I was thinking of the different climate change impacts that I've witnessed myself, and at first I was thinking that, oh no, I haven't lived long enough yet. But in my short 24 years, I started thinking of the beaches and the creeks that I used to visit, the salmon that I used to watch my mom and my grandpa pull from the river and fillet. And the mild temperature of the Vancouver summers and winters. I've seen all of that be impacted by our changing climate. And I feel very privileged that I get to see both sides of the scientific world, but also the cultural side, and being able to see how our culture has been changing over the years. Yesterday I asked my Uncle Iggy how can our culture sustain climate change? How can we continue to pass on these teachings when the skills that I'm being taught, I don't get to practice every day. I don't get to fillet a fish every summer because of low salmon stocks. I don't get to visit the creeks that my grandma used to visit because they're dried up now. And what about all the forage fish that my grandma used to talk about that I haven't been able to see because there are no seabeds or bulk kelp beds? And so that really got me thinking, and so I'm very lucky in my position that I get to sit down with my Uncle Iggy and kind of talk and be able to learn and absorb that knowledge, because with changing times and changing technologies as well, in the old times we used to only orally pass down our history and pass down our traditions. And now with technology, that's changing. So now we see that disconnect a little bit from our youth to our elders, where not as many of our youth are sitting down with our elders. And I'm very fortunate that our nation has been taking a big role in changing that, and having our youth come out and host the climate summit like this, and being able to sit down and talk with all of you and have all of your knowledge as well come to the table. And I'm very fortunate for that. Would you like to add anything?
Fine.
Okay, lost.
I'll keep on.
Keep going. He's teaching me right now. Just keep pushing forward. Let's see what I have in my notes. And I'm really happy to see, so my younger sister today she's helped put on the Climate Summit as the Climate Action Intern. My other sister, Ocean Hyland, has used her art as a way to become an activist. She's very vocal. She's out there at the protests, at the demonstrations, standing on her megaphone and encouraging the youth of today to not be discouraged by the climate change impacts and kind of the big voices and the big dogs that are on top, but be able to stand strong and stand up for Mother Earth and stand up for the values of we're all connected through the land, through the water, through the animals. And I was always taught as a kid that Mother Earth gives to us what we need, not what we want. And she is a provider, not a giver, which means, to me at least, that she provides us, but we also provide her as well. She doesn't just give it to us. And we need to respect that, and we need to know that Mother Earth is living and breathing. The ocean expands and collapses, and it breathes for us, and the trees breathe for us, and we must protect them. And I have my great-grandpa, Chief Dan George, one of his speeches. I just want to quickly read it because I felt it really kind of captured why I'm in the position I'm in today. The time will soon be here when my grandchild will long for the cry of a loon, the flash of salmon, the whisper of spruce needles, or the screech of an eagle. But he will not make friends with any of these creatures, and when his heart aches with longing, he will curse me. Have I done all to keep the air fresh? Have I cared enough about the water? Have I left the eagle to soar in freedom? And have I done everything I could to earn my grandchild's fondness? My great-grandpa spoke that years and years ago, before my time, before I was born. And the fact that it still holds true today makes me feel like I'm on the right path, makes me feel like I'm following in his big footsteps. And that makes me really proud, and I'm glad that I lived in Montreal and did my schooling, but I'm really proud that I got the opportunity to come back and support my nation and be part of the youth today that are really becoming part of the front line and part of the main voices and activists that are out there today, all across the board, not just for environmental concerns. And I'm really glad that to see my own family members out there as well. That's all I have to say.
That was great. First of all, I'd like to just raise my hands to our young youth for stepping up and helping with this conference. You know, it just it makes me proud. You know, I told them, you know, when you're doing a speech, don't be saying Here I am, because I'm sort of stuck a bit there because I'm so proud of them. And I believe that it's because, you know, they're learning their language. And I think that's just giving them that much more confidence. I've told them, you know, I've only got 22 years more to go. If I go 21, I'll be happy. When I seen that graph up there at 2050, I thought, well, I'm going to be 9 years short. But there was so much that was said today that usually I have to start right at the beginning, but if I start right at the beginning, we'll be here till, I don't know, way back somewhere. That's a joke between us two here. She was telling me a story one time, and she said, you know, way back in the 90s, you know. I said, oh, yeah. But to touch on a bit, I think it was it Stephen? No. Was it Stephen? Stewart. Talking about the rising tide. Like my grandson said that, you know, we've been married for 60 years, and we built our house down on my inlet in 1959. And in 1959, the highest tide then was 13 feet in January. The last few years, we've gotten 16 foot 7. So that's a lot of water in 60 years. Their prediction, I think, is just a little bit off when they say it's only going to rise so many meters per near a meter in by 2050. I think it'll be a little bit higher. I have a huge cedar stump that's in front of my property there. The high tide now comes up the back of it. I figure by 2020 it's going to be floating, and it'll probably float away. I mean, that stump is from here to the other side of the table here, round. I've lost about 25 to 30 feet off my western shore, and the western shore on my property was a huge blue clay bank that ancestors used to use for poultices and pottery and cooking utensils and stuff. And on the eastern side, I figure I've lost about 25 feet off of that. Our pictures on the wall, I mean, after, like say, January, the high tides, they'll skew themselves like this. So my house is still level, but the ground is dropping, and the bank is dropping. The bank where I used to have to cut right to the edge, it used to be about 5 feet high. I mean, it's pretty near water level now, so it's sloping quite a ways down. And I heard about putting hard stuff against riprap, against the beach. You know, it stops certain growth, and it stops certain insects and stuff that the fish need. But from our perspective, what we've lost on our shore now, I would say it's in the acres that we've lost off our little reserve. And that's not going to be replaced. There's a high ridge from Strathcona to Belcarra that when the tides come in, it swirls around through Port Moody over to Strathcona, Darton, Little Cates Park, Waututh, Cates Park. And I'd say on Cates Park it's lost about a good 100 feet off that point. Little Cates, I'd say it lost about 150 feet, that much. And then there's a point at the end of our reserve, I would say it's lost about 100 feet off that too. All that silt ends up on our supposedly Maplewood mudflats, which is all cobblestone and shell right now. And I can't believe the height of some of them bars out there. Some of them gravel bars, they're a good 15 feet high. Some of them even 20 if you go right to the far end of one of them. All this silt has come around, and the farthest navigational light at the point of the mudflats, up until I would say the mid-'80s, you'd have to swim to the dolphin and climb up the ladder to the light. The last few years, at zero tide or even a one tide, you can just walk straight out to that dolphin now and climb up. Whereas way back in the 80s, we used to have to swim to it. We GPSed the whole mudflats, I believe in 2007, I believe, somewhere around there. And I'm real interested to see, to GPS where we GPSed before. There was a marker that our uncles and my dad put out in front of the old canoe shed for a starting pole. And up until, I'd say, the 1980s, early 80s, late 70s, I'd have to wear hip waders to go out and mark it at a, like, say, a 1 or 2 foot tide. We GPS'd that in 2007, and it was 35 feet high and dry. So all that silt has filled in on the mudflat there. And one of my bucket lists, like I worked on a golf course all my life to start with. And the last job we did was out at Tsleil-Waututh Bay. And the company pumped 890 cubic yards of sand 2 miles downriver. They pumped it up to the golf course for sand to build on. My bucket list would be if we could take all that silt that has washed up against the mudflat and put it back on the mudflat and made it a mudflat again. Bring back the bulrush, bring back the seagrass, and rehabilitate it close to what I used to remember it by. That would help filter out the water throughout the inlet. It would recircle. Just east of my house, there used to be a huge bull kelp bed. I mean, the heads were about that big. The sheets were wider than this table and about twice as long. During the summer, my mother worked for my grandmother. Our grandmother, I should say, had 1,000 chickens. And my mother used to go work for her and gather eggs, feed the chickens and stuff. So during the summer, she'd just make us breakfast. We'd have to do the dishes, do our chores. We just had a wood burning stove, so we had to prepare kindlings and wood for the next day. And after that, we were on our own. So we'd just take the dugout and we'd go fishing for tommy cod or for sea bass amongst the kelp beds. If we didn't want to eat fish, we went and dug clams. If we didn't want clams, we went and got crabs. I mean, we fed ourselves, and in doing so, we actually gathered enough for our supper, for our parents' supper. I think Ernie, youngest, third youngest, third oldest. Well, you know what I mean. That's 3 of them. I think he was the last one that I ever took fishing or digging clams. You know, I've never been able to take my grandchildren, and I won't be able to take my great-grandchildren. But as Hillary was saying, you know, they have the knowledge, they know what is done and how it's done. Will they get a chance to do it? In my heart, I say, yes, they'll get a chance if we all work together and accomplish a few of these things to correct, like they were talking about the acidity in the water and how the water absorbs the carbon. You know, if we could get the kelp back and what you guys call eelgrass, I call seaweed, if we could get that back in there, it would start, the sea force would come back and it would start absorbing that carbon again. We introduced elk into the Indian River Valley in 2005? 6? And we finally got to hunt to hunt the elk in 2012? 2012. They got me to go up there as the elder, for these young hunters. And I trudged through the bush like I used to do. But even then, I could feel there was a change. There was a change in the forest. I don't really know what it was, but listening to everybody talking, I believe that it would be the oxygen in the forest. It didn't seem as I remembered it when I was younger, hunting with my dad, how fresh it used to be in the forest all the time. I mean, you could hike up and down the mountain as many times as you want. But now it just seems like it's I'm not saying dead air, but you just don't get that morning freshness of oxygen in the forest where you used to get it all the time. And in the inlet, with the higher tides, like when my dad was teaching me canoes, and he was teaching me the currents what to look for, which way the current was going, which way the wave was facing, where this faster water was, or where you're bucking the water. It was easy back then because there used to be just sort of one and a half different ways that the water was going around in the inlet. But now, like when I'm sitting out there watching a high flood or it's going out, I can see about 6 different currents out in the middle now. So it's going back and forth like this because there's so much water to go through the narrows now that it's got to come back and it's got to circle around before it starts going out. So the younger people now that are paddling, they're paddling in different water than we're paddling. There used to be so much seaweed down in front of the old canoe shed that when the tide started dropping, you couldn't paddle your dugout across it. It was too thick. Your paddle would just get hung up in the seaweed. You'd have to pole your way out, and even at that time, if you used a pole, you still got tangled up. But now, down in front of our place, I can pretty well count the number of seaweed that's there. On our beach, we had a huge little neck clam bed there, and my uncle and my aunt next door, they had a huge one too. And the first thing we learned was we just took what we needed, and it replenished itself all the time. We never ever ran short of it. But now, the name of that clam that's taken over now.
The Maya species?
Yeah.
Soft shell?
Soft shell is taken over now. And we used to have numerous amount of cockles. And the only reason why I remembered the cockle is because that's what my grandmother used to use for us young kids when we were babies. They used to use that for teething. And we could chew on that all night and still not get through it, So it's stuff like that that I remember. And when we'd go hunting, the whole reserve would share on what we got. But of course, back in that day, there was only 9 houses on the reserve, and they were all my aunts and uncles, and 2 of my grandmothers. And that's another thing that I think that I was able to make it through residential school and public school was because I had two grandmothers to look after me. And the same with our children. They had two grandmothers. And we're a matriarchal society, so the grandmothers really, really, really make a big difference. When my grandmother was teaching me how to fillet a fish or get it ready for sky to hang, if I made a mistake, she just took my hand and showed me how to do it. She never ever got mad at me, but she just showed me how to do it again. So that's the way our people used to grow up under that tutelage. Residential school changed everything. In residential school, you were disciplined. I mean, you were disciplined in a lot of different ways that I had a hard time talking about it before, but you know, I've gone through over 100 hours of therapy to understand why I thought and did the things that I did. What I've learned now is that I've passed some of that on to my children, and they're passed it on to some of their children. But I look back on it, the way my grandmother taught me, I've been able to pass that on to our children and grandchildren too. But there was always the thought of my parents lost that knowledge from their grandmothers because they had to spend 8 years in residential school. They lost the old people's parenting skills. In our day, any one of my aunts or uncles, if I did something wrong, they could tell me, "You're doing it wrong," and I listened to them. Children nowadays, if you try and discipline a little child, the parent will say, "That's my kid. You don't do that." That wasn't our way. Our younger youth now are starting to understand that, and they're starting to be able to discipline their nephews and nieces. And their nephews and nieces are starting to understand, okay, my auntie can discipline me. I got to listen to her. My uncle tells me this. I got to listen to him. We're slowly getting back to the way it was before contact. And they're starting to share more. And they're starting to understand how the old people were. The old people, there was always a leader, a chief, a sub-chief, anything you want to call them. But they were never higher than the next person. We all listened to them. We were all taught by them. But they were never above us, and they were never below us. If this was before contact, everybody in here had a say. But if our leader decided we're going this way, we all went that way. We might have argued a little bit, but it was always common sense that made the decisions. And you can't go against common sense. Climate change is here, and it's going to get a little bit worse until we all start working together. We can have all these different studies, and we can all agree or disagree with each other. But in the end, we have to come to the consensus. And that's what our ancestors used to do. They used to come to a consensus and say, okay, this is the way we're going to do. We can't go hunting over here no more. Somebody did it wrong. The way the old people did is they buried the guts and entrails so that the deer would always come back to that place, or the bear would always come back to that place. If you left it open to rot, sure, the other animals and crows and birds and everything benefited. But that animal never came back to that spot again for years and years. I had 7 uncles. And throughout the inlet and and up the arm, there was 7 different places where that was their spot to hunt. If one of the uncles didn't get anything in his spot, he'd go and ask his brother, can I go hunting there? And he'd say, sure, go ahead. But he always asked. He could have just went there and got a deer and say, well, I got it over here. But they were honest with each other. They went and asked and said, can I hunt in your place? They'd say, sure. So when they hunted there, he always gave a quarter, a hind quarter, to his brother for letting them hunt in his place. And if his brother did it to him, he always brought a quarter back to him. Our great-grandfather, we're the Wolf clan. Our great-grandfather, he'd paddle up the inlet and he'd start giving his wolf call. The wolf would hear them and they'd steer the deer down to wherever our great-grandfather was going to be. He got his deer. He just got out of his dugout, got his deer, cut off a hind quarter, left it for the wolf, took the rest. Every time he went up there, he'd give his wolf call. They'd herd the deer down to him. They did things like this. They worked with Mother Nature. If they took a tree, they blessed the tree, they prayed to the tree and took it and said, we'll use good use for it. And they used everything. Same with any animal they killed, any bird they killed. They used everything. They used the down, the feathers. Somewhere along the line, the world got turned upside down. In the old days, if you wanted to be the biggest chief on the coast, you give a potlatch and you give away more than whoever's challenging you. You're the bigger man because you give away more. The world's upside down now. The more you got, the more you take. Supposedly, you're the bigger man. But if you really think about it, and you accomplish that, are you really the bigger man? Or does it feel better when you share with everybody else? Share your knowledge. Share your life. Share your love. No hatred nowhere. Just because I don't like the color of the shirt you got on, it doesn't mean I hate you. I just wish you wore the same color I did. I don't know whether we used up our time or not, but...
Yeah.
Oh, everybody's saying, yeah, you did. But every time I every time I get to talk, I don't really know what I'm going to be saying. It just comes out. It comes from my heart. And I just like sharing the life that my ancestors knew. When my uncle was talking to me, I didn't realize that he was teaching me. Because every time I heard the same story, I thought, oh no. Here comes that story again. But you know, that story's back here. He was teaching me. And that's why we're oral history. And that's why I like talking to the younger generation. I know my son-in-law, every now and then he says, oh, I like that story about this canoe race, tell it again, And I've told it about, I don't know how many times. I mean, it was 50 years ago, so I guess I've told it that many times, I guess. At least once a year. Again, I'd like to ask you guys to stop shaking your heads and, go like this. Thank you very much. Heisiam, Heisia, thank you. Heichka, raise my hands, please.